Welcome to Restful Bible Nights. This is your time to rest. Let the noise of the day fade away as we settle into peace together. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to let your body settle. Let your shoulders drop, just a little. Feel the weight of them release downward. Let your jaw soften. There's no need to hold tension there. Let your breath slow, naturally, without effort. Feel the surface beneath you supporting you fully. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore. The day is done. This is your time to rest. Let everything soften. Let everything relax. Now that your body is resting, let us begin tonight's story. A story of a worried disciple, of a stormy sea, of a Savior who calms both waters and anxious hearts. The sun was setting over the Sea of Galilee. The sky burned with shades of amber and rose, colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. The water reflected them back like a mirror, creating a world of light and color that hung suspended between heaven and earth. On the shore, a young man sat on a smooth stone worn by countless waves. His name was Simon. Though most people called him by his family name, Simon bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah. A fisherman and a man whose hands knew the feel of nets, and whose eyes knew the moods of the sea. But tonight Simon was not fishing. Tonight he sat alone, watching the water, lost in thought. His mind was crowded, too crowded. Thoughts tumbled over one another like waves, each one demanding attention, each one pulling at him. The day had been long and exhausting. Jesus had been teaching by the shore, and the crowds had pressed in from all sides. Thousands of people, all wanting something, all needing something, needing healing, needing answers, needing hope. Simon had watched it all. He had helped manage the crowds. He had seen the sick brought forward. He had heard the questions shouted from the back. He had felt the weight of all those expectations pressing down. And now, in the quiet of evening, all those impressions swirled in his mind, mixed with his own worries, his own questions, his own fears. What was he doing here? He was a fisherman, not a teacher and not a holy man, not someone qualified to follow a rabbi who spoke with such authority, who performed such miracles, who drew such crowds. His fishing business was suffering. He had left his nets more days than he had tended them in recent weeks. His brother Andrew kept assuring him it was worth it, that following Jesus was the most important thing they could do. But the practical worries gnawed at Simon anyway. How would they eat if they didn't fish? How would they support their families? What if this all ended tomorrow and they had nothing to return to? And then there were the bigger fears. The darker worries that came in the quiet moments when Simon was alone with his thoughts. The religious leaders were watching Jesus. Simon had seen the way they looked at him. They were suspicious, hostile, calculating. Jesus was making waves, disturbing the established order, challenging their authority. That kind of thing didn't end well. Simon knew enough history to know that to be a true concern. What if following Jesus meant danger? What if it meant trouble? What if Simon had brought his family into something that would destroy them all? He picked up a smooth pebble and tossed it into the water. It made a small splash, sending ripples outward in perfect circles. He watched them expand, overlapping and eventually disappearing into the vastness of the lake. That's how his worries felt. Like ripples that kept expanding, touching everything, but never quite disappearing. Behind him, Simon heard footsteps on the shore. He turned to see Andrew approaching. His face seemed peaceful in the golden light of sunset. "I thought I'd find you here," Andrew said softly. He sat down on the stone beside his brother. Simon didn't respond. He just kept staring at the water. Andrew studied his brother's face. "You're worried?" he observed. It wasn't a question. Simon let out a long breath. "How can I not be worried?" he finally said. "Andrew, what are we doing? What have we gotten ourselves into?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. That gentle, knowing smile he had worn more and more since they had started following Jesus. "Do you remember," Andrew said slowly, "that day when we first met him, down by the Jordan River?" Simon nodded. Of course he remembered. How could he forget? John the Baptist pointed to him, Andrew continued. And John said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." I didn't fully understand what that meant, but something in me knew I had to follow him, so I did. And then I found you and brought you to meet him. Simon remembered how Jesus had looked at him that day. He really looked at him. He had seen him in a way no one else ever had. And Jesus had said something strange. Something Simon was still trying to understand. "You are Simon, son of Jonah. But you will be called Peter, the rock." Simon hadn't felt like a rock. He felt like sand. Shifting, unstable, and uncertain. "I don't feel like a rock," Simon admitted quietly to his brother. "I feel like I'm drowning. Like there's too much. Too many questions. Too many fears." Andrew placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Then maybe," he said gently, "it's time to let Jesus calm the storm." As if on cue, they heard a voice calling from farther up the shore. It was Jesus. He was standing with the other disciples, preparing one of the boats. "Come," Jesus called to them. "Let us go to the other side." Simon and Andrew exchanged a glance. The other side meant a journey across the lake with several miles of open water. It would take a few hours, and night was falling. But they rose without question. When Jesus called, you followed. That was becoming clear to all of them. They made their way to the boat where the others were already gathering. James and John, the sons of thunder, as Jesus affectionately called them. Matthew, who still seemed amazed that Jesus had chosen a tax collector. Philip, always practical, and Nathanael, always thoughtful. And the others, 12 men in all. An unlikely group bound together by their choice to follow this extraordinary teacher. Jesus climbed into the boat and immediately moved toward the stern. He sat down, and within moments, he was lying down on a cushion someone had placed there. His eyes closed almost immediately. He was exhausted. They all were, but Jesus especially. The demands on him were relentless. Everyone wanted something. Everyone needed something. And he gave, and gave, and gave. Now finally he could rest. The disciples pushed the boat away from shore. Simon and Andrew took positions at the oars. They knew these waters. They had fished here since they were boys. They could navigate to the other side with their eyes closed. The evening was calm. There was water smooth as glass. The boat glided forward easily, cutting through the mirror-like surface and leaving a gentle wake behind them. The sun had fully set now. The sky deepened from gold to purple to the rich blue-black of night. Stars began to appear. One by one, then dozens, then hundreds. The same stars their ancestors had watched. The same sky that stretched over all the world. For a while, everything was peaceful. The rhythmic sound of oars dipping into water. The gentle creak of the boat and the soft conversation of tired men grateful for a moment of rest. Simon felt some of his anxiety begin to ease. There was something about being on the water that always calmed to him. This was his element. This was where he belonged. Maybe Andrew was right. Maybe he was worrying too much and for nothing. But then, he noticed something. The wind had picked up, just slightly at first. A gentle breeze that felt refreshing after the heat of the day. But it was growing stronger. And the direction was wrong. Simon glanced at Andrew. His brother had noticed it too. They had both spent enough time on this lake to recognize the signs. The Sea of Galilee was notorious for sudden storms. The way the hills surrounded it created strange wind patterns. Air would rush down from the mountains, sweeping across the water with devastating speed. Calm could turn to chaos in minutes. And that was exactly what was happening now. The wind grew stronger. The gentle breeze became a steady blow. The smooth water began to ripple, then chop, then heave in larger and larger swells. "Get the sail down," Simon shouted to James and John. They scrambled to comply, fighting with the ropes as the wind whipped the fabric wildly. The boat began to pitch up and down and side to side. The oars became nearly useless as the water churned around them. Within minutes, the storm was fully upon them. The wind howled. Rain began to fall, first in large scattered drops, then in sheets that blurred everything. The disciples grabbed whatever they could hold onto as the boat lurched violently. Waves rose up, dark mountains of water that seemed to tower over them. The boat would climb up one side of a wave, teeter at the top where the wind hit with full force, then plunge down the other side into a trough where the world disappeared and there was nothing but water walls on every side. Water poured over the sides. The disciples who weren't manning the oars grabbed buckets and began bailing frantically. But for every bucket they threw out, two more came in. The boat was filling with water fast. They were sinking, and there was nothing they could do about it. Simon gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white. All his earlier worries seemed foolish now. He had been worried about his fishing business, about what the religious leaders might do. Those concerns meant nothing when you were about to drown. This was it. This was how it would end. They would capsize in the middle of the lake. They would sink into the dark water and they would drown. All of them. And all the potential, all the promise, all the hope that Jesus represented, would sink and forever disappear with them. Another wave crashed over the bow. Simon lost his grip and slid across the deck. He grabbed a rope, held on, and gasped for air as water streamed down his face. Through the rain and darkness, through the chaos and terror, Simon suddenly remembered something. He remembered Jesus was with them. But where was Jesus? Simon turned his head, squinting through the storm. There in the stern, in the back of the boat where he had lain down to rest, Jesus was still quietly and soundly sleeping. Simon couldn't believe it. How could anyone sleep through this? The boat was nearly swamped. They were moments from death. The wind was screaming. The waves were crashing and it felt as if the world was ending. And Jesus was sleeping through all of this chaos. His chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of deep rest. His face relaxed. His body completely at ease despite being soaked with rain and spray. He looked like a man without a single worry in the world. Something broke in Simon. Whether it was fear or frustration or desperation, he didn't know. But he found himself crawling across the pitching deck toward the stern. He had to use both hands, had to time his movements between the waves. He had to fight to keep from being thrown overboard. Finally, he reached Jesus. He grabbed his shoulders tightly and shook him awake. "Master!" Simon shouted over the wind. "Master, wake up!" Jesus stirred. His eyes opened slowly and peacefully, as if waking from a pleasant nap on a quiet afternoon. Simon's voice cracked with emotion. "Don't you care that we're perishing? We're all going to die." Jesus then sat up. Water streamed down his face. His hair was plastered to his head, but his expression was completely calm. He looked around, taking in the storm, the waves, and the terror-stricken faces of his disciples. And then, Jesus slowly stood. He stood in the stern of that pitching boat as if it were perfectly still. He stood with the wind whipping his robes. He stood with the waves crashing around him. He stood with the confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to fear. He raised his hand. And then he spoke. He spoke only one word: peace. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. It carried authority, the authority of the one who had spoken worlds into existence, the authority of the one who commanded even the elements. Jesus commanded, "Be still." And instantly the wind stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. It didn't die down over minutes. It simply stopped. As if someone had closed a door. As if the wind itself had heard a command it could not refuse and had obeyed immediately. The waves that had been mountains of water, they flattened and smoothed. They became as calm as glass. The surface of the lake went from violent chaos to perfect peace in the space of a single breath. The rain stopped. The clouds began to break apart. Through the gaps, stars appeared again. The same stars that had been hidden moments before. The same eternal sky. The boat, which had been pitching and rolling, settled into stillness. It floated on water so calm it barely made a sound. The only movement was the gentle lapping of tiny wavelets against the hull. Peaceful and rhythmic, like a lullaby. The silence was profound. After the screaming wind, after the crashing waves, after the shouting and the terror, the silence felt like something you could touch, something holy. The disciples all stood frozen. Some still held buckets. Some still gripped ropes or the sides of the boat. They were all soaked, all exhausted, all staring, first at the calm water, then at Jesus. Jesus sat back down. He looked at them with an expression that was gentle, but also questioning. As if he were a teacher waiting for his students to understand something important. "Why are you so afraid?" he asked softly. "Do you still have no faith?" The question hung in the air. Simon felt it pierce straight through him. Why had they been afraid? Because the storm was real. Because the danger was real. Because they could have died. But Jesus had been with them. Jesus had been right there, sleeping peacefully, because he knew. He knew there was nothing to fear. He knew who he was. He knew what authority he carried. And he had been trying to teach them the same thing. The disciples slowly began to move again. They put down their buckets. They loosened their death grips on the ropes. They looked at each other with wide eyes, with expressions that mixed awe and fear and wonder. "Who is this?" one of them whispered. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." Simon sank down onto a bench. His legs felt weak. His whole body was shaking. But not from cold, from something else. From the realization of what he had just witnessed. He had seen Jesus heal the sick. He had seen him teach with authority. He had seen him attract crowds with his wisdom and compassion. But this was different. This was power over creation itself. This was authority over the forces of nature. This was divine. Simon looked at Jesus. Really looked at him. Jesus had lain back down on his cushion. His eyes were closed again. He looked completely relaxed. As if calming a life-threatening storm was the most natural thing in the world. as if there had never been anything to worry about in the first place. The boat continued across the now calm water. The disciples took up the oars again. But their movements were slow, sort of dreamlike. They were still processing what had happened. Simon couldn't stop thinking about it, about the storm, about his fear, about Jesus' question. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? The truth was, Simon's fear hadn't started with the storm. The storm had just brought to the surface what was already there. Simon had been afraid all day, all week. He had been carrying anxiety like a heavy burden. Worry piled upon worry. Fear layered over fear. He had been afraid of practical things, of losing his livelihood, of not being able to provide, of making the wrong choice. He had been afraid of larger things, of the religious leaders, of the Romans, of the direction this was all heading, of what might happen to them, what might happen to Jesus, what might happen to everyone. And underneath it all, he had been afraid that maybe he wasn't enough, that he wasn't qualified, that he would fail, that Jesus had made a mistake in calling him. But Jesus carried none of that. Jesus had slept through the storm. Not because he was careless or unaware, but because he knew. He knew who his Father was. He knew what authority he carried. He knew that even the wind and waves would obey him if he spoke. And if Jesus knew all that, if Jesus had that kind of power and authority and peace, then what did Simon have to fear? The answer was obvious. Simon had nothing to fear. Not really, not if Jesus was with him. The storm hadn't been able to harm them. Not because they were skilled sailors, though they were. Not because they had fought hard, though they had. But because Jesus was in the boat. And where Jesus was, there was peace, there was safety, there was authority over everything that seemed threatening. As these thoughts settled into Simon's heart, something began to shift inside him. Not all at once, not completely, but the beginning of something, a loosening, a releasing. All those worries that had seemed so heavy, so important, so urgent, they began to feel less solid, less real, like mist that might burn away in the morning sun. What was the point of worrying about provision when Jesus could feed 5,000 with a boy's lunch? Simon had seen him do that just days ago. What was the point of worrying about the religious leaders when Jesus spoke with authority that made their arguments crumble? Simon had watched that happen over and over. What was the point of worrying about his own adequacy when Jesus had looked at him and called him Peter the Rock? Jesus saw something in him that Simon couldn't see yet. But maybe that was enough. Simon realized something. His worries had been real. The things he feared could actually happen. There might be hard times ahead. There might be opposition. There might be suffering. Jesus had never promised that following him would be easy or safe in worldly terms. But, and this was the crucial thing, Jesus would be there. Jesus would be in the boat. And that changed everything. The storm might come. In fact, more storms would almost certainly come. But Jesus had authority over the storms. He could speak peace. He could bring calm. He could command the chaos to be still. And more than that, even if the storm raged, even if the waves crashed, even if everything seemed to be falling apart, Jesus could sleep through it, because he knew. He knew the end of the story. He knew his Father's purposes. He knew that ultimately everything would be all right. The boat finally reached the other shore. The disciples climbed out, pulled the boat up onto the beach. Jesus stretched and smiled at them, as if the whole evening had been perfectly pleasant. The disciples started gathering their things, preparing to find a place to rest for the night. But Simon lingered by the water. Jesus noticed. He walked over and stood beside Simon, looking out at the calm lake. The moon had risen now. It painted a silver path across the dark water, beautiful and peaceful. Hard to believe that water had been trying to kill them just an hour ago. "Master," Simon said quietly, "I'm sorry I doubted. I'm sorry I was afraid." Jesus was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice gentle. "Simon, you're learning. All of you are learning. You've seen me heal. You've heard me teach. But tonight you learned something different." "What's that?" Simon asked. Jesus smiled. "That I am present in the storm, not just after it, not just before it, but in it. I was there in the boat with you the whole time. The storm was real, but so was my presence. And my presence is greater than any storm." Simon felt tears prick his eyes. That was it. That was exactly it. "But I worry," Simon admitted, "about everything. About things I can control and things I can't. About today and tomorrow and next year. My mind never seems to rest." Jesus nodded. "I know, Simon. I know your heart. But let me ask you something." He gestured to the lake. "Did your worrying stop the storm?" Simon shook his head. "Did your frantic bailing save the boat?" "No," Simon said quietly. "You did." Jesus placed a hand on Simon's shoulder. "The birds of the air don't worry about tomorrow. They don't stockpile food or make anxious plans. Yet your heavenly Father feeds them. The lilies of the field don't toil or spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of them." Simon had heard Jesus teach about this before, but hearing it now, after the storm, it landed differently. "If God cares for birds and flowers," Jesus continued, "how much more will he care for you? You are worth far more than many sparrows, Simon. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him." "So I just ever don't worry?" Simon asked. "How do I do that?" Jesus smiled. "You do what I did tonight. You rest in the knowledge that your Father is in control. You trust that his purposes are good. You remember that he is with you, always, in the calm and in the storm." He paused, then added softly, "And when the anxious thoughts come, and they will come, you speak to them the way I spoke to the wind and waves. You say, 'Peace, be still.'" Simon took a deep breath. The night air was cool and clean. The stars overhead were bright. The water beside them was perfectly calm. Everything felt different than it had just hours ago. "Peace," Simon said quietly, testing the word, tasting it. "Be still." Jesus smiled. "Yes, just like that." They stood together in comfortable silence for a few more moments. Then Jesus turned toward where the other disciples were setting up camp. "Come, Simon. Let's rest. Tomorrow has enough worries of its own. Tonight, we sleep in peace." Simon followed, and as he lay down on the ground, wrapped in his cloak, looking up at the vast starry sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. He felt the gentle touch of peace. Not because his circumstances had changed. Not because all his questions were answered. Not because he suddenly understood everything that lay ahead. But because Jesus was there, in the boat, in the storm, in the calm. Simon was beginning to understand. That was enough. The days that followed that stormy night brought many changes for Simon and the other disciples. They continued to travel with Jesus. They witnessed more miracles. They heard more teachings. They saw the crowds grow, and they saw the opposition grow as well. But something had shifted in Simon. The memory of that night on the lake stayed with him. When anxious thoughts would rise in his mind like waves, he would remember. He would remember Jesus sleeping peacefully while the storm raged. He would remember the authority in Jesus' voice when he commanded the wind and waves. He would remember that simple word and he would say, "Peace." It didn't mean Simon never worried again. He was human. He still had moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the storms of life seemed overwhelming. But now he had something to return to, a memory, the truth, an anchor point in the chaos. Jesus was in the boat, and that changed everything. One afternoon, several weeks after the storm, Simon found himself alone with Jesus again. They were on a hillside overlooking the sea. The other disciples had gone into a nearby village to buy food. Jesus was praying. He often withdrew to pray, seeking his Father's presence, drawing strength and direction from that communion. Simon had learned not to interrupt these times. But when Jesus finished, he opened his eyes and saw Simon sitting nearby. "What's on your heart, Simon?" Jesus asked. Simon hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I've been thinking about that night in the boat, about the storm, about what you said." Jesus nodded, waiting. "I want to have that kind of peace," Simon continued. "The peace you had. The peace that lets you sleep through a storm. But Master, how? How do I get to that place?" Jesus was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a small stone and held it in his palm. "This stone," he said, "has no worries, no anxieties, no fears about tomorrow." Simon smiled slightly. "Well, it's a stone." "Exactly," Jesus said. "It simply is what it is. It doesn't try to be more or different. It rests in being exactly what God created it to be." He tossed the stone gently, caught it. "You, Simon, are not a stone. You're human." You have a mind that thinks and plans. A heart that feels deeply. That's not a flaw, it's how you were created. But, Jesus continued, you can learn to rest in who you are the same way this stone rests in what it is. You can stop trying to control everything. Stop trying to figure out every outcome. Stop carrying tomorrow's burdens today. How? Simon asked again. Jesus looked at him with deep compassion. By knowing who holds tomorrow. By trusting that your Father sees you. By remembering, over and over again, that you are loved, deeply loved. Not because of what you do or don't do. Not because of how strong or weak you are. But simply because you are His child. When you truly know you are loved, Jesus said softly, when you truly trust that your Father is good and His plans are good, worry loses its power. Or you might still feel it. The anxious thoughts might still come. But they don't have to control you. They don't have to determine your response. He placed the stone in Simon's hand. Do you know what I was thinking about that night when I slept through the storm? Simon shook his head. I was thinking about my Father, Jesus said, about His faithfulness, about His promises, about His presence with me always. I knew with complete certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to do. And I knew that no storm, no matter how fierce, could separate me from His love or derail His purposes. That's why I could sleep, Jesus concluded. Not because I didn't care, not because I was unaware, but because I was so deeply rooted in my Father's love and truth that even a life-threatening storm couldn't shake that foundation. Simon looked down at the stone in his hand. Heavy, solid, unchanging. I want that foundation, he said quietly. I want to be that rock you said I would be. Jesus smiled. You will be Simon. You're becoming it even now. Every time you choose to trust instead of worry, every time you remember my presence instead of focusing on the storm, every time you speak peace to your anxious heart, you're becoming that rock. It's a process, Jesus added gently, not a single moment. You're learning and growing. You are being transformed. Be patient with yourself. Your Father is. Simon tucked the stone into his belt. A reminder. A tangible object he could touch when the anxious thoughts came. A way to remember this conversation. A way to remember this truth. Jesus stood and stretched. Come, let's go meet the others. They should be returning soon with food. And I'm hungry. Simon laughed. Jesus was fully divine, but he was also fully human. He got tired. He got hungry. He needed rest and food and companionship just like everyone else. And somehow, that was comforting too. Jesus understood what it was like to be human. He understood the physical needs, the emotional struggles, the mental battles. He wasn't some distant deity observing from afar. He was right here, in the midst of it all. As they walked down the hillside together, Simon felt lighter. Not because his circumstances had changed. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had been reminded of the truth that mattered most. He was not alone. He was loved. And Jesus had authority over every storm. the weeks and months that followed, Simon had many opportunities to practice what Jesus had taught him, to choose trust over worry, to remember peace in the midst of chaos, to rest in the presence of God rather than the anxiety of circumstances. One day, Jesus gathered the disciples on a mountainside. A large crowd had assembled, as crowds always did when word spread that Jesus was teaching. People climbed the steep path, found places to sit on the grass and rocks, and waited eagerly to hear what this remarkable teacher would say. Simon sat near the front with the other disciples. He had his stone in his hand, the one Jesus had given him. He turned it over and over in his palm as he listened. Jesus stood where everyone could see him. The morning sun illuminated his face. His voice carried clearly in the still air. And then he began to teach about the very thing that Simon had been struggling with, the thing they all struggled with. They all struggled with worry. "Therefore I tell you," Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm, "do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear." Simon leaned forward. This was exactly what he needed to hear. "Is not life more than food?" Jesus continued, "and the body more than clothes?" He gestured to the sky above them. A bird swooped past, riding the air currents, free and graceful. "Look at the birds of the air," Jesus said. "They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" Simon watched another bird land on a nearby branch. It sang a cheerful song, then flew off. No anxiety, no stress, just being, just living and trusting. "Can any one of you by worrying add a single hour to your life?" Jesus asked. The question hung in the air. Simon thought about it. All his worrying, all his anxious planning, all his fearful thinking. Had it ever actually helped? Had it ever solved a problem or prevented a difficulty? No, it had not. If anything, worry had only made things worse. It had stolen his peace, clouded his judgment, made him less present, less capable, less trusting. Jesus continued, "And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these." Simon looked around at the hillside. It was springtime. Wildflowers dotted the grass in every direction, reds and purples and yellows and whites. Each one beautiful, each one perfect, each one created and sustained by God. "If that is how God clothes the grass of the field," Jesus said, "which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith?" You of little faith. Simon felt the words pierce his heart, not in condemnation, but in loving correction. Jesus wasn't angry. He was teaching and guiding. He was helping them see. Their worry was not a lack of trying. It was a lack of faith. A failure to truly believe that God was good, that God was present, that God would provide. "So do not worry," Jesus continued, saying, "What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Your heavenly Father knows. That was the key. God knew and God saw. God understood every need, every concern, every legitimate worry. And He was not distant or indifferent. He was Father. He was personal and loving. He was caring. Jesus' voice grew even more tender. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek first the kingdom. Make that the priority, the foundation, the focus, and everything else. All the things we worry about, they would fall into place. Not because worry was unnecessary, but because God was faithful. And then Jesus said something that Simon would remember for the rest of his life. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Do not worry about tomorrow. Simon realized he spent so much energy worrying about things that hadn't happened yet. Things that might never happen. Possible futures. Potential problems. Imagined disasters. But Jesus was calling him to live in today, to be present in this moment, to trust God for this day and let tomorrow take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus wasn't saying life would be easy. He wasn't promising that difficulties wouldn't come. But He was saying that today's troubles were enough to deal with. There was no need to borrow troubles from tomorrow. As Jesus finished teaching and the crowd began to disperse, Simon sat for a long time on that hillside. He looked at the birds. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the sky. And he made a decision, a choice, a commitment. He would learn to live like the birds and flowers, not carelessly, not irresponsibly, but trustingly, restfully, and peacefully. He would seek first the kingdom. He would focus on what God was calling him to do today. And he would trust, really trust, that God would provide everything else. It wouldn't be easy. Simon knew himself well enough to know that. The anxious thoughts would come. The worries would rise. The fears would try to take hold. But now he had tools. He had truth. He had the memory of Jesus calming the storm. He had Jesus' teachings about God's faithfulness. He had that stone in his hand as a reminder. And most of all, he had Jesus himself. Jesus was present and always available, walking with him through every storm. The testing of Simon's new commitment came sooner than he expected. Within days, the religious leaders began to increase their opposition to Jesus. They questioned him publicly. They tried to trap him with their words. They whispered among themselves about how to stop him. Simon felt the familiar anxiety rising. This was dangerous. These were powerful men. They could make trouble. Real trouble. The kind that ended with arrests and trials and possibly worse. But then Simon remembered. He pulled out his stone. He held it tight. Jesus was in the boat. That's what mattered. Whatever storm was coming, Jesus was present. Jesus had authority. Jesus could speak peace. Simon took a deep breath. He let it out slowly. He consciously released the anxious thoughts. He spoke quietly to his own heart. Peace and be still. And remarkably, it worked. Not perfectly, not completely. The anxiety didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened its grip. It became manageable. Background noise instead of a deafening roar. Simon was learning, growing, becoming that rock that Jesus had called him to be. There were other storms too. Times when the disciples had no food and didn't know where their next meal would come from. Jesus fed thousands with a few loaves and fish. The lesson was clear: God provides. Times when they were exhausted and didn't know how they could continue. Jesus withdrew to pray and returned with renewed strength. And somehow his peace was contagious. The lesson was clear: God sustains. Times when the crowds pressed in so heavily that Simon felt overwhelmed by all the need. Jesus touched one person at a time with perfect presence and compassion. The lesson was clear: God is sufficient for this moment. Each experience built on the last. Each storm weathered added to Simon's faith. Each moment of choosing trust over worry strengthened that foundation Jesus had talked about. Simon was not perfect. He still had moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the anxiety seemed to win, but he was changing, slowly and steadily but surely. The rock was being formed. One evening, after a particularly long day, Simon found Jesus sitting alone by the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those familiar shades of amber and rose. The same colors as that night weeks ago when this whole journey had begun. Simon sat down beside Jesus. They didn't speak for a while. They just sat together, watching the light change, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Finally, Simon spoke. "Master, I wanted to thank you." Jesus turned to look at him. "For what, Simon?" "For teaching me about peace," Simon said. "For showing me that worry doesn't have to control me. For that night in the storm when you showed me what real faith looks like." Jesus smiled. "You're welcome. But Simon, you should know. The peace you're experiencing? That's not coming from me. Not ultimately." Simon looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm teaching you," Jesus explained. "I'm showing you. I'm walking with you. But the peace itself, that's coming from the Father. That's His gift, His presence, His Spirit at work in you." He paused, then added softly, "I won't always be here with you, not in this physical form, but the Father will always be present. His Spirit will always be available. The peace I'm teaching you to access now, that peace will remain even when I'm gone." Simon felt a flutter of anxiety at those words. Jesus gone? What did that mean? But Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let your heart be troubled, Simon. Trust in God. Trust also in me. I'm telling you this now so that when the time comes, you'll remember. You'll know that my peace is not dependent on my physical presence. It's a gift that transcends circumstances. Peace I leave with you," Jesus said, his voice carrying a weight of promise. "My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid." Simon didn't fully understand, but he stored these words in his heart. along with all the other things Jesus had taught him, all the experiences they had shared, all the storms they had weathered together. He had a feeling he would need to remember these words someday, in some future storm that he couldn't yet imagine. But for now, for tonight, he was content to sit beside his teacher and friend, to watch the sunset, to feel the peace that had been settling into his soul day by day. The anxious Simon who had sat on this shore weeks ago, worried about everything, afraid of the future, uncertain of his calling, that Simon was still there. But he was being transformed, renewed, rebuilt into something stronger. Built into a rock, just like Jesus had said. Years would pass. Simon would witness many more miracles. He would hear many more teachings. He would grow in faith and understanding. He would become Peter, the rock, the leader among the disciples. But there would come a day when everything Jesus had warned them about would happen. A day when the greatest storm of all would break over them. The day Jesus was arrested. When Jesus was tried, condemned, and crucified. That day Peter would fail. In his fear and confusion he would deny even knowing Jesus. 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted. The anxiety and terror would overwhelm him, and he would make the choice he never thought he would make. And in that moment, Peter would feel like he was drowning, like the boat was filling with water and there was no hope of rescue. He would weep bitterly. He would despair. He would believe he had lost everything. But then, 3 days later, the impossible would happen. Jesus would rise. Death would be defeated. The tomb would be empty, and Jesus would appear to his disciples. And one of the first things he would do is find Peter. Not to condemn him, not to shame him, but to restore him, to reassure him, to remind him that even in his failure, even in his worst moment, God's love and purposes remained unchanged. Jesus would take Peter aside. He would ask him 3 times if he loved him, mirroring the 3 denials, giving Peter a chance to affirm what was true in his heart. And each time Peter said yes, Jesus would give him a commission, a purpose, a calling. Feed my sheep, Jesus would say. Take care of my flock. The anxious fisherman, the worried disciple, the failing follower, he was still called, still chosen, still valued, still being shaped into that rock. And after Jesus ascended to heaven, after the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, Peter would become that rock in ways he never imagined. He would preach boldly. He would lead courageously. He would face persecution without fear. Not because he was naturally brave. Not because he had overcome his tendency toward anxiety on his own, but because he had learned where true peace comes from. He had learned that Jesus' presence was not dependent on physical proximity. He had learned that God's Spirit was with him always. When Peter would later write to believers scattered across the Roman world, believers facing their own storms of persecution and suffering, he would share what he had learned. Cast all your anxiety on him, Peter would write, because he cares for you. Cast all your anxiety. Don't hold on to it. Don't carry it. Don't let it control you. Give it to God. Why? Because He cares. That truth, that simple, profound truth, had transformed Peter's life. And he wanted others to experience the same transformation. Peter would also write about something else he had learned. In another letter to believers, he would talk about peace. Grace and peace be yours in abundance, he would begin. And then later he would write these words. In your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. The reason for the hope. That was the key. Peter had hope because he had experienced Jesus. He had seen Him calm storms, both literal and metaphorical. He had heard Him teach about God's faithfulness. He had witnessed His death and resurrection. He had received His restoration and commission. And all of those experiences, had built in Peter an unshakable foundation. A rock-solid confidence that no matter what storms came, God was present. God was faithful. God could be trusted. The anxious fisherman had become the confident apostle. Not through his own strength, not through his own willpower, but through learning day by day to rest in God's presence and trust in God's peace. And what God had done in Peter, He could do in anyone. He could do in you. And now, as we come to the end of this story, let yourself rest in that same peace that Peter learned. The peace that comes from knowing you are not alone. The peace that comes from trusting that God sees you, knows you, loves you. The peace that comes from believing that even in the storms, especially in the storms, God is present. You don't have to have it all figured out. Peter didn't. You don't have to be strong enough on your own. Peter wasn't. You don't have to overcome your anxiety through sheer willpower. Peter couldn't. What you need, what we all need, is to remember that Jesus is in the boat. Whatever storm you're facing tonight, whatever worries kept you awake, whatever anxieties you carried into this moment, Jesus is present, right here and right now. He speaks the same words to you that He spoke to the disciples that night on the lake. The same words He spoke to Peter on the hillside. The same words He spoke to the wind and the waves. Peace and be still. Let those words wash over you now. Let them sink deep into your heart, into the places where anxiety lives, into the corners where worry hides, into the depths where fear takes root. Be still. You are not defined by your anxiety. You are not trapped by your worry. You are not condemned for your struggles. You are seen. You are loved and you are held. God knows what you're carrying. He knows what keeps you awake at night. He knows what makes your heart race and your mind spin. He knows, and He cares. Cast all your anxiety on Him, Peter wrote, because He cares for you. So do that now, in this moment. Cast it, release it, let it go. Imagine yourself in that boat with the disciples. Feel the wind, Feel the waves. Feel the fear. It's real. It's valid. It's okay to acknowledge it. But now, look to the stern of the boat. See Jesus there. He's not asleep this time. He's looking at you. His eyes are full of compassion, full of understanding, full of love. He stands. He raises his hand, and he speaks. Peace and be still. And just like that night on the Sea of Galilee, the wind stops. The waves calm. The storm quiets. Not because the circumstances have changed, but because Jesus has spoken, and his word carries authority over everything that threatens you. Feel that calm settling over you now, like a warm blanket on a cold night, like gentle hands on your worried brow, like a loving presence enfolding you completely. You are safe. You are held. You are loved. There's a verse in the Psalms that speaks to this moment. Simple words. True words. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. In peace, not in anxiety, not in worry, not in fear, but in peace. You can lie down. You can sleep, because God alone makes you dwell in safety. Not your vigilance, not your planning, not your anxious thoughts racing through possible scenarios. God and his presence, his protection, his promises. You can rest now. Not because everything is resolved. Not because all questions are answered. Not because tomorrow is guaranteed to be easy. But because God is faithful. Because Jesus is present. Because the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you. Because you are never, ever alone. Let your breathing slow, in and out, steady, rhythmic, and peaceful. Let your body sink deeper into rest. Release the tension in your shoulders. Soften your jaw. Relax your hands. Let every muscle let go. Let your mind release its grip on the day, on tomorrow, on all the things you cannot control. Just let it all go. God is here, in this moment, in this darkness, in this quiet. Not far away, not distant, not unreachable. He's here, close and present. Jesus is in the boat. That's all you need to know. That's all you need to remember. That's enough. You can sleep now, dear one. You can rest. You can let yourself be held by the one who spoke worlds into existence, who calms storms with a word, who knows every hair on your head and every worry in your heart. Tomorrow will come. It will bring what it brings. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, you rest. Do not worry about tomorrow, Jesus said, for tomorrow will worry about itself. So don't. Not tonight. Tonight, you rest in peace. You sleep in safety. You trust in love. The anxious fisherman became the confident apostle. The worried disciple became the faithful rock. Not overnight, not without struggles, but gradually, steadily, and surely. And the same transformation is available to you. Not all at once, not perfectly, but real, true, and possible. One choice at a time. One day at a time. One moment at a time. Choosing trust over worry. Choosing peace over anxiety. Choosing to remember that Jesus is in the boat. But that's tomorrow's work. Tonight, you simply rest. Rest in the knowledge that you are loved, deeply, completely, and unconditionally. Rest in the promise that God is faithful, always and forever, without fail. Rest in the presence of the one who says, "Peace, be still." Good night, dear one. May you sleep in peace. May you wake in hope. May you know deep in your soul that you are held by love itself. The storm may rage tomorrow, but tonight, there is peace. Sleep well. You are safe. You are loved. You are held. Good night.